I see some of you have been here all day, so I just want to congratulate you for your perseverance. I'm really impressed. My name is Sarah Lawrence. I'm the Dean of the School of Art and Design, History and Theory at Parsons. I am not going to share my story of my dossier. I was reviewed so long ago, so early in the process, that things have really changed a huge amount since then, but changed for the better. I think that's what I'm going to speak to. I think I'm invited here to speak because I served on APT at Parsons, I chaired APT, and now I sit on UPRC. So I've kind of gone through the gamut, but I really think what's more significant is my being able to speak to the history of these reviews since the beginning, because they really have the growth of their process of review starting within Parsons and APT, and I can only speak more recently within UPRC, this is my third year on that committee, is that there has been this incredibly thoughtful and respectful effort on the part of all of us to really think about the precedents we're setting in considering issues of renewal and advancement and promotion in a broad range of practices, often in fields, certainly within Parsons, that don't have an established tradition for tenure or other opportunities for renewal and promotion. And I've seen my colleagues really struggle at how to articulate most clearly for one another how to establish what is good, what is excellence, how we want to build a community among ourselves at every level, so that we can really stand by it and recognize that every decision we make really is setting a precedent in a very significant way. I think one detail I wanted to speak to, just to be sure you understand, and I guess I'm not really addressing what I'm supposed to be, which is contextualizing your work. But going back to David Carroll's remarks, first of all, David, being named Sarah Lawrence is a whole lot worse than being named David Carroll, so start with that. But his reference to the black box and the mystery of the process, I really feel good that we're working very, very slowly toward a moment where, while there is a lot of discretion and confidentiality in the process, I'm really hoping we can move away from thinking of it as a mysterious black box, that we're really acting with as much transparency as we can. We aspire to even greater degrees of transparency and openness in the process. And I urge you all to trust in that process. And I know I sound a little Pollyanna-ish, but I think that in terms of addressing contextualizing your work and its impact on the field, the thing to remember is that that's what you need to do, and you need to do it with integrity and thoughtfulness. You should not miss a detail of any aspect of your work. You want to look over your CV when you've completed it and be sure that you are including in your narrative an elaboration and documentation of everything you speak to in that, but to really trust that what you say, and if you say it with clarity and with enthusiasm for what you've been doing in the 5 years of your review, will be appreciated by your colleagues when you get through the PPR process, when you get through the APT process, and then through the UPRC. That what we're looking for at UPRC, and Sven has also served on that committee, so he can speak to it in its earlier generation. What we're really doing is looking to be sure that the candidate has very clearly articulated the range of impact that he or she has had, that the various subcommittees within the division have responsibly addressed what the candidate puts forward and justified what the external letters might say if that's part of the process, and being sure that the argumentation is consistent, is respectful, and responsible. And so at each level, it really is allowing and confirming that if you've done your work and you've spoken openly about your work and with honesty and enthusiasm about your work, that you will be evaluated very fairly on what you've produced. So on that Pollyanna-ish note, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Laura.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me here. I guess that I'm here. I'm actually not sure why I'm here, but I'm delighted to be here. It's always a pleasure. I was just thinking Sarah articulated why she was invited, and it never dawned on me to wonder. I don't know. Maybe they needed somebody to fill out this panel. Anyway, lovely to see you all. And so I will address a little bit more, I guess, directly the issue of context. And let me just give you a little bit of background, which is that basically, if you were to tell anybody that you spend your life studying, let's say, 18th century French art, you would get a lot of blank stares. I know because I do this. And the question of telling people why anybody should care is actually one of my primary tasks. And although I think that what I do is highly obscure, I would suggest that that is nonetheless the primary task of everybody who is putting together a dossier, regardless of how obscure or how common or how, in your view, self-evident the significance of it might be. You have to go into writing that document as though it's not evident to anybody. The single best piece of advice that I got when I was putting together my tenure dossier, well, first of all, the most intelligent thing I think I did was go to people at NSSR and ask them. I showed them my CV, and I said, what do you make of this? And, sorry, an airplane joke just came into my head. Sorry, those of you who've seen that movie 1,000 times. But I went to the people, at NSSR and said, what do you make of this? And they said, Art Bulletin? I don't know, that sounds like, some newsletter that you post on the bulletin board. And I said, thank you, because it happens to be the most prestigious journal in my field. But of course, to Mr. Political Science, it sounded like something that you put on the bulletin board. So to me, for example, this is an example, but so to me, it would have been self-evident that that was a major accomplishment, but actually it isn't. So number one, assume that your audience knows nothing about what you do or your field. They know only what you tell them. So the burden is really on you, but it also means the opportunity is yours. And I highly encourage you to think about it that way. The process of putting together a dossier, at least for me, was actually, since I guess I'm Pollyanna too over here, the dossier process for me was actually one of extreme satisfaction, because when I sat down and I looked at my output, and I had some 18th century French art, and I had some reviews of contemporary art in Time Out New York, and I had some museum work, and I had some queer studies work, and I looked at it and I thought, my God, this makes no sense. But I knew that my job was to tell a story, and this panel is about narratives. So I knew that my job was to tell a story. So I took this as a writing project. What story am I telling? And I went back before this panel and looked at the first sentence of my personal statement. And it says, although my work is topically diverse and addresses a wide range of practices and time periods, it always proceeds from the assumption that objects of art and design are politically engaged, socially effective participants in history. And I look particularly at moments of social and political upheaval. And that gave me a framework. I mean, what I did was I took this disparate group of objects and practices and figured out for myself what do they actually have in common. And that was actually rewarding for me, because I was able to actually derive some meaning from my work. Other than I'm doing this project and I'm doing that project, they thought, no, actually I do have a project. And to me, that was an extremely satisfying moment. So of course, you're doing this not for the sake of personal satisfaction, but for the sake of convincing other people. But what I think I found was that it was in that process of writing a narrative that anybody could understand that I was able to also convince myself. And I want to make just one last comment, which is that what I just described is actually an extraordinarily challenging project for most of us. I was speaking with a junior colleague just the other day who came to me and showed me his CV, and it had areas of interest, and there are 13 of them listed. And I said, well, that doesn't mean anything to me. And he said, well, but I'm interested in all of those. I said, I'm sure you are, but what do they have in common? Because no reader is going to be able to make sense of 13 apparently disparate things. So the final word that I want to leave you with then is to do what I did and what that junior colleague did, which is take your dossier, take your statement, take your CV, and to show it to somebody who knows nothing about what you do. Nothing at all. This was somebody in management. I know nothing. But simply by receiving my responses of utter confusion, he realized what he had to do. And I think that that's probably the most instrumentally important piece of advice that I could offer.
Thank you. I'm Sven.
We've said it all.
He's no Pollyanna.
I'm not a Pollyanna. I'll be brief, because I know it's been a long day and I don't have that many relevant things to add to the conversation, but I'll be brief in the following way. I've been around the university, and particularly Parsons, for a long time, and I want to make clear that when tenure and extended employment was instituted, I was completely and utterly opposed to it. I thought it was a horrible thing. I thought we had an opportunity to do something different within our institution, and I actually still believe that pretty strongly. I know that I'm speaking to an audience, not necessarily of the converted, but of people who have either gone through or right in the middle of the process. So this may not be insightful in that regard, but what I would say is that put me in a position when I was, I think, the same round as Sarah, when we were kind of actually forced to go through this. We were kind of told, you've got a choice. You can either do this or quit. It wasn't quite that drastic, but they've actually changed a number of things since then that aren't quite so draconian, so you actually have a little bit more of a choice. But so we were kind of forced into it. And that led me to what actually ended up to be a really interesting process, and I think a lot of what Laura and Sarah have shared are certainly things that I experienced as well, but I just want to make a couple of basic points. One is that I think that the number one thing as you're writing your narrative is to be honest. I have read probably way too many dossiers since this, and I'm struck by people's dedication to telling a story which I sometimes feel isn't quite their own. I think that we all benefit in a number of ways by trying to be as brutally honest as possible with the narrative that we put out. And that's not always easy. I view myself generally as a pretty dishonest person. So I actually think we all are. I'm just throwing out a lot of negativity here, but it's okay. It's just, in this process, I think that's an excellent starting point. And it's one that will lead the development of not only the narrative, but the dossier in general in what I think are generally some very positive directions. One direction that it will lead your narrative in is you will tend not to exaggerate if you are being honest. And this is one of the things that I find rubs me the wrong way more than almost any other aspect of people's narratives, is when they feel the need to tell me how wonderful what they've done is. You know, I sort of want to make that decision myself, and it's really not necessary. And usually if you're being honest, you don't feel the need to elaborate in that way. For me, it actually resulted in another very fundamental experience in going through this process, is that it really forced me to evaluate what working and teaching at Parsons meant. I guess I view myself as relatively reflective, but going through this process definitely made me kind of hone in and say, well, what does this mean? In particular, as I noted to start with, as my attitude towards the whole process was pretty much that we were being forced down a road that we shouldn't be forced down. So I think in that regard, and this is where I'll end, this is something that too many people don't do enough of, and that is really reflect on why the institution is important to you and why you may have a relevant role in the institution. Often the narrative is treated somehow as something that's kind of floating there and could be dropped down into any university that it happens to be flying over. I don't think that's true. I think for most people who have gone through certainly the few years that have led up to whatever kind of review you're approaching, whether it's term or PPR or EE or tenure, you have forged a relationship of some sort with this institution. And I think that needs to be part of what you write about. It doesn't have to be huge. For me, it was. I was up for EE, and my role had a lot to do with my institutional relationship. But I think this is too often something that people forget, is that you are asking for the institution to approve of you. So I think defining the role you have and the meaning you have to the school is part of what you have to be putting in the narrative. Thank you.
How would you, when you talk about the role of the faculty member in the school, you're talking about context on this panel, how do you think certain faculty members contextualize themselves within their program, whether it's school or the university? How would you suggest people begin to consider it?
Be honest. What do you do? I mean, it's a good question, Thomas, but these are very simple questions. We all have a role, and I think by really looking at what these roles are in relation to the institution, it's not all just about service. It's about how we teach. It's about how our research has an interplay with what we're doing. It's why I started with this honesty thing, is because I think too often people forget that the panel who are reading your dossier probably know pretty well who you are and what you're doing. So
I don't think so.
I actually don't, I disagree.
But please continue.
then we have a disagreement. You guys all have to remember that if you're coming up for review, okay, if you're coming up for review in front of what is one of these committees, right, and no one on that committee is aware of you, that says something about your relationship to the institution. This committee is well represented, okay? It's not perfect, and I'm not making that claim, but all I'm saying about this case is that if you start with a gut reaction to what you're really doing, I think it is relatively easy to build the context in answer to your question, Thomas.
Can I just offer, I will be brief, I will pass on to Sarah. I just offer a little bit of what I would suggest might be nuance that I think is important, that actually depends on the type of your appointment and the type of review that you're going up for.
Absolutely,
and I think
yeah.
this is an important thing to remember, and I think it often gets forgotten, which is that if you're going up for RTA review is based on your job description. So you might, based largely on your job description, you might want to hew much more carefully to that in making your case rather than try to make some other kind of argument that you think you should make. If you're coming up for tenure, you're making a different kind of argument than if you're coming up for EE. If you're coming up for PPR, you're making a different kind of argument. So I think that it depends. I mean, that sounds really vague, but I feel like you should also be mindful of what the role of that particular review is in the life cycle of your career.
I think that's very true. And just to underscore one point, with an RTA review, you are obligated to speak very directly to institutional need. And that's part of the process. It's part of the process right up front, and it's part of the process of the review. But I think part of your question is to keep that in mind as well when you're talking about other types of review, PPR, EE, and tenure track. And I guess the one piece of advice I'd suggest just as an exercise is we all get very caught up in our work, in our course preparation, our own research, scholarship, and creative practice, our own committee work. So one way you might enter into this process is, take a look at the mission statement of Parsons. Take a look at the mission statement coming out of the provost's office. It's a current reflection of ideas that are out there, which you may or may not connect to. But it's an opportunity for you to broaden your reflection of your place within Parsons, not just within your program or within your school, but to think more broadly about the kinds of issues that are under consideration right now.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I just wanted to try to somehow understand Laura's comments about the neutral reader or the blind reader, if you like, and Sven's comments about kind of brutal honesty. I think that to me, I understood both of your comments in the context of somehow using some technique to get outside of your own subjectivity about what it is you do. You know, I think we can be great critics of others, which was a point I was trying to make earlier a little bit, but not such great critics of ourselves sometimes too. And I feel that those two remarks are connected in that way somehow.
I think that's absolutely right.
I have a quick question. I was wondering, so for tenure track specifically, what do you think the balance is at Parsons vis-a-vis your relevance to the field, vis-a-vis your relevance to the institution in the dossier?
I think they should both be addressed. I don't think you should privilege one over the other. I think you should make a strong argument about both as you're working on your narrative.
I think there are, certain requirements in terms of the review process. A review for, it was already brought up in relation to RTA, but a review for tenure tends to look at, well, it doesn't tend to, it looks at the requirement of a ranking of excellence in RSCP, whereas EE must have a ranking of excellence in teaching. So there are different emphases, but I think it's right on that you have to paint the full picture. I think this is a mistake that has been made by people when they believe that just their RSCP will get them through. And you have to, when you're up for review, and really whatever the process is, they're looking at the full spectrum.
Got it. Thanks.
When you speak to university context, which I think was great, the chance to position yourself in the university within your division, and then also take into consideration the way your school dean perhaps has positioned you within your program. When you speak to that, when you speak to the, not a contract, but our contract letter, I understand positioning yourself in the university, which I think is great. But then how do you also speak to your school in your contract? If you're RTA, for instance.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Schools tend not to have the same kind of fully articulated mission statement, and you also don't have the opportunity to read the letter that your school dean is writing for you. I can only speak about my own practice, which is when I have a faculty member who's coming up for any type of review, we have a long conversation about what they are, how they plan to present themselves. Sometimes I read drafts of what they've written. And I consider it a kind of collaborative effort to get everybody advanced, whatever that means. And so while they won't have a chance to read my letter, they have a very good sense of what I'm going to say, and they have an opportunity to give me input on what they would like me to emphasize. But I, in turn, will have already said to them, these are the areas that I am most interested in your work, that I see the greatest impact, the greatest promise. And this goes back a little bit to Francesca's question, which is, what we're looking at is, whether it's in research, scholarship, and creative practice, or in service, or in teaching, is that there is both significant impact that can be demonstrated, but also a future trajectory of what you can grow into. And that also has a lot to do with your match with Parsons and with the university as a whole, that I can look, as school dean, I can look down the road and say, that person is really important to where we're going. But that comes out of a kind of more of a dialogue with the individual, because it doesn't have that contextual reference.
And if I may just underscore and add to what you just said, I actually, when you posed the question, Thomas, when you said the role that your school dean has put you in within the school, and I found myself thinking, well, no, your school dean should never put you in a role. Your role should always be evolving in dialogue with your school dean, and maybe with your program director, depending on the structure of the area that you're in. But so that actually by the time you come to the moment of having the kind of review discussion that Sarah is having, actually it should be nothing brand new. Nothing should be coming as a surprise. So I actually think that as we're talking, or as I was listening, I guess I found myself thinking that actually we sometimes tend to think of these processes as beginning, X number of months, the review process or the dossier process is beginning X number of months before the dossier is due. Well, actually, that's not really true. It's not a sporadic thing. It's an ongoing thing. And I think that it needs to be an ongoing thing. There actually needs to be ongoing dialogue in order to be sure that you're actually, I've been here, God, it's my 13th year. Isn't that alarming?
Are you serious?
I am serious. You hired me
Yeah, I
13
remember, but
years ago.
It must have been more recently than that.
It wasn't. I swear to God. Anyway, so in the past 13 years, if I were to have sort of wakened my 13-year-ago self today and seen this university, I would be shocked at what I would say would make no sense. If I hadn't been continually in dialogue with people, continually aware of the changes that are going on, and continually reassessing, reevaluating, reformulating my role, and what contributions I can make and where I can fit in, I would be confused and lost, and it would make it very, very difficult to produce that dossier. So I guess that's just a thought, that it actually should be an ongoing dialogue.
Actually, that's one of the things, I don't remember who was up here who was talking about having attended the Selkin workshops. Are they still doing that?
They are, yes.
They are. One of the things that they recommended, which I took to heart and actually fits very well within what you're saying, Laura, is the idea of viewing whatever narrative you create as an ongoing process. So hopefully you write it, you develop it, you successfully go through whatever review you're facing, but you keep updating it, you keep going back in and editing it, not on a daily basis, but it becomes a sort of organic live document. And then at a point where you may be re-reviewed, I mean, this is one of the things about RTA is a little bit different than EE or tenure, is there's this, hopefully not endless ongoing process, but it's more frequent, and it's easier if you just aren't starting over every time. The other comment I wanted to make about, getting back to your question, Thomas, is that it's interesting if you look at faculty across the board, look across everyone in this room, the assignments, if you don't know who the faculty are actually kind of similar. We're all teaching. We've, in some cases, got administrative roles, in other cases, not. We're all serving on too many committees. We're all pretty much too busy. And we've all got something we're doing that's our own work. And in this case, this is another reason why it's really up to you, not necessarily to differentiate yourself from your colleagues, but to do a good job of illuminating how you have engaged with these assignments, which are so similar. Sometimes you read a dossier and it details, I am teaching this much. And you kind of look at it and your reaction is, well, so is everybody. I mean, or most people are. But you really want to know more about what that teaching has meant, how you have brought unique things to it. And I'm just talking about teaching here, but it is the same thing when you start listing service. And that's actually one really important thing that I got out of Selkin is do not make lists. Don't do it. This is a narrative. Don't say that I was on the following committees. Talk about your committee work. Use an appendix for lists, and that's a practical thing, but it actually, in reading through narratives, it helps a lot if it's truly a narrative and not bullet point lists of everything you've done. That kind of, you skim over a little too quickly. Thank you.
Thank you.